Welcome to Chapter 6 in the AI Evals for Everyone course. In this chapter, we'll be diving into production deployment and how the scenario changes from testing your application offline to what it actually means to deploy it online and what do you need to keep track of. Until now, in the previous chapters, we've discussed about what are evaluation metrics and different types of evaluation metrics. And we've also talked about how to evaluate your application in the scenario of like given a data set and how do you build these data sets. Now, when you take your application to the production, a lot of things changes. Until now, we've been testing it on carefully chosen examples which reflect the expected behavior of your application. And this is defined by either like an engineering team, product management team, or leadership, and this gives a clear direction of what the application is supposed to be doing. And there are also like stakeholders who understand these goals very clearly, and that helps in the streamlining the process of understanding the product development and where do you need your application to be positioned as. But once you launch it in production, things start behaving very differently. When real users start interacting with your product, they use it in ways which is not always foreseeable by the developers or by the product team. Now, you might consider an application like customer support where it's answering like hundreds of thousands of requests per day, and even if a very minor percentage of it goes wrong, it still leads to a lot of like edge cases that you need to consider about, and then you need to improve your application. So let's dive a bit more into what kind of issues that you can see when actually real users start using your application. One is unexpected context. You might have designed your application with certain set of use cases in mind or certain kind of interaction, but real users could ask your product about competitor products or like share some personal stories or like give life advice and things like that, which you haven't actually designed this for. And the great advantage or the disadvantage as well with Gen AI applications is that the surface area is extremely large of interactions in terms of input and the output. So it becomes hard to control how the user exactly behaves with your application. There are also a lot of unseen edge cases that come up when your user is interacting with the product, which you might not have thought of before. Imagine things like it's a customer support application, but it's asking you to solve a math problem. And you need to be making sure that it doesn't actually respond with incorrect answers in those cases or like straight away acknowledges the fact that it's a customer support but it cannot help with that. So these are some issues that you can actually foresee coming, and sometimes you cannot because of the scale of applications or the scale of customers that your product is being used for. And now the more subtler case of this is also evolving consumer behavior. Think of applications where you've designed with a basic agency in mind. And once the customers start getting comfortable with your product, they want to use your product for like more complex use cases. And then the customer behavior is evolving. When the customer behavior is evolving and you haven't tested it out explicitly, that becomes another avenue for production issues. And compounding on top of all of this, the volume of the request once your application is successful really changes everything. And what we mean by that is the scale of the number of queries. So when you have an application, when you have like an evaluation data set offline, and you know each and every example in that data set, and you have the time to actually go and review your product's answers for those application, then it's really easy to like understand whether the failure is expected or if there is anything can be improved. Now imagine your product is going to do this like answer hundreds of thousands of queries. It becomes very infeasible for even a large team of members to look at each of these failures or even understand whether an interaction is actually a failure or a success. So this issue compounds with scale, and it's definitely not a feasible way or a scalable way of actually deploying your applications at scale. So we need a different mindset shift here in understanding how do you actually make your application work for this specific set of use cases, to understand whether am I doing the right thing in my application when it's deployed, and if there is something wrong, do I have confidence that I'll actually be notified that there is something going wrong with your system. So that is the shift that we are going to talk about here, from evaluation to monitoring. And what we call here as like evaluation is also offline validation. So what is evaluation or validation here? Validation is something that you do pre-deployment, where you have this reference data sets, what like we discussed in the previous chapters, and you make sure that your application is actually getting good metrics or good score on top of those data sets. But once you go into production, your job is to not making sure that like every edge case is like being handled correctly, but being alerted when something is going wrong. So once you establish this kind of mindset shift, and you are now shifted to a to a mindset of like, I'm looking for cases where something could go wrong, but I don't need to essentially know what is wrong, but I just need to know what is what did, like, something went wrong. So that is the flywheel effect. So this is the shift we are talking about, evaluation to monitoring or validation to monitoring. What we are essentially saying is we need to go from a scenario where we have like a reference data set, and we made sure that we built enough confidence that our application is doing well on that reference data set. So this is the offline part that you are doing it pre-deployment, where you're actually developing the application. And once you go to the production, your duty becomes not to understand the failure in each interaction, but just the fact that you need to have enough visibility that a certain interaction can be flagged, and it can be flagged for review. And there are also multiple ways in which you can flag this to avoid like providing harmful responses to the users. So this is a entirely different mindset of like production monitoring that we'll be discussing slowly. And these two in combination, the validation and the monitoring, form this data flywheel, where you can like essentially think of it as a self-improving product now, in the sense that you define this strong evaluation data set, which gives you the confidence to actually go ahead and deploy the application. But once you deploy the application, you need to think about what are the key product metrics that I need to monitor in production. And once the key metrics are in place and you have the ability to flag incorrect conversations, you can always take them and then come back and design better and stronger evaluation data sets, so that you keep this loop improving. And the ideal scenario is that as your product spends more time in production, it identifies more and more patterns that needs to be solved, and that will help you gain better knowledge. And at the end of the day, you will have like a better application that is constantly improving on these evaluation data sets. Now, the key challenges in understanding whether something is going wrong in production has 4 categories, right? One is log filtering. And what we mean by log filtering is, imagine you're logging your interactions in a customer support application, but it is really hard to expect any human or even for like a very code-based metric to give you the answer of like whether a certain log is actually useful and for understanding the correctness of the response. So this is where log filtering comes into place, where you understand what kind of logs are useful for actually determining this, and then only log those, or like filtering these logs. So this is more of a combination of product and developer interaction, where you decide the kind of logs that you need to be keeping around. And then metric selection is the next criteria, where like we've talked about multiple kinds of metrics, right? There are code-based metrics, heuristic metrics, LLM judge metrics. While there are many metrics, it's incredibly hard to actually construct this elaborate suite of metrics and deploy them in production. And what I mean by production is running those metrics for every interaction that your application does. It becomes prohibitively expensive, and it adds a lot of noise to the system that you cannot really identify what are the things that really need to care about when understanding whether an interaction has gone wrong. And the third one is offline versus online. There are certain differences that you can do offline and certain things that you can do online, and we'll be discussing more about that. And the fourth category, this is a very holy grail of like actually building successful AI applications, is the ability to identify emerging issues. And what we mean by that is, as an application developer, you have an understanding of what could be a certain category of issues that could go wrong. But the whole idea of building these flywheels is that nobody can predict what kind of interactions can go wrong. So the ability to have the right checks and balances in place, so that if there is an emerging issue, you are able to identify that is a key criteria that we need to develop as well. So let's double click into the offline versus online part. So what is the main difference? So by offline evaluation, what I mean is nothing interacts with the application in terms of the delivery to the user. So this is basically your typical process of like gathering some data sets from the logs or application history, and then building a data set, and then like actually basically going and like doing things, right? And then online evaluation is happening in the real time as the model is responding to the users or like generating the response and processing this user request. You can do things over there. And the key difference is not just the cost in terms of elaborate metrics, but also the simplicity that matters. You don't want your application always to be waiting on a complex LLM judge to provide its response and then grade it it and only then return to the user. It is applicable in scenarios, some scenarios, but many scenarios, the online checks needs to be fast and lightweight. For example, think of harmful content filter, right? You can use a cheaper LLM, or you can actually have a heuristic based metric that can be used to identify this thing. Whereas in the offline evaluation, you can come up with much more complex metrics that can actually identify like very thorough and sophisticated mistakes that your application could be doing. This is the a kind of difference between offline and evaluation or online evaluation that you need to keep in mind on what kind of metrics that can be used here. And this doesn't mean that in online evaluation you cannot use LLM judge. You can always use LLM judge, but make sure that it's a smaller model, or it's looking for like a broader category of issues rather than very narrowed down sophisticated use cases. So the key takeaways in this chapter are production is different. We have seen on how many categories that production is different in terms of what kind of metrics you can use, or the checks and balances you have in place versus working with an offline evaluation data sets. And then how evaluation transfers into monitoring mindset when you are deploying the product in production. And the third thing is about the 4 kinds of challenges. We talk about log filtering, metric selection. Why do we even need to care about what can be done in online on offline evaluation? And we'll be talking about more of this in detail in the next chapters. So in the next chapter, we'll be discussing about production monitoring strategies, basically diving into the details of how exactly each of these 4 categories can be implemented in like practical applications, and understand how those decisions actually impact the amount of visibility you gain into the application once it's deployed in production.